afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish on Sunday the 18th of April. My name's Maggie Lennon and I'll start with the up-to-date coronavirus statistics. There were 210 newly confirmed cases of COVID yesterday, 2 new reported deaths of people who had tested positive. 2,733,387 people have received their first dose of a COVID-19 vaccination and 715,714 have received a second dose. On Saturday and Sunday, only the headline statistics on new cases, deaths and vaccinations are now being updated. Since the start of the pandemic, a total of 1,875,410 people in Scotland have been tested, and of these, 1,652,149 tests have been confirmed as negative, meaning 223,261 people had positive tests. And very sadly, 7,642 patients who tested positive have died. I'm joined today for the programme by theatre critic and Scotsman columnist Joyce McMillan and Broadcasting Scotland's regular Kate Cary. Welcome to you both. It's been a week of manifestos and developments towards the election. I had a quick look at most of the manifestos this week that have come out. There seems to be some emerging themes. Might want to think about wains, trains and windmills. Is there anything else, Joyce, that's caught your eye in particular?
Well, I think that one of the things that's slightly surprising is the sort of ambition of some of these manifestos. I think that, the SNP's manifesto is the longest one, I think, they've ever produced, certainly in recent years. And it does contain a huge amount of detail about the party's ambitions for Scotland. And I think people were somewhat expecting that after 14 years in government, the SNP might be a bit shorter of ideas than that. Of course, with the SNP government, the question is always about delivery. They've never been short of good ideas in that sense. They've always been in favour of this sort of greener, fairer, more prosperous Scotland that was the strap line for the 2014 referendum. But nonetheless, it's interesting to see such a wealth of ideas sort of milling about in the political scene in Scotland. And of course, that will be added to, presumably, when Alba launch their, I think they were having a policy conference yesterday. So we'll begin to see a bit more of an outline of what their economic policies might look like sometime in the coming days. So there are actually plenty of ideas bubbling and boiling about. But I think there's a kind of question about the way the debate works around the independence question, which is that for most people, the noise of the independence question just drowns out everything else, and so a lot of the policy detail in these manifestos, I think, is not going to get the kind of discussion that it really needs, and that's a great shame. I think you're right to identify policies for children as having a great importance, and I don't know whether that reflects Nicola Sturgeon's personal priorities. She certainly talks a lot about making a better future for Scotland's children, but there do seem to be a lot of concerns about levels of child poverty. And of course, the hit that children's education has taken because of the COVID pandemic. And I'm sure all of the parties will be trying to address that. Although I must say the Conservatives, as usual, seem so obsessed with certainly the leaflets that I've had through the door. I haven't read their manifesto if it has been launched yet, but I think their total focus on the independence question suggests that they may not have much more to add, even on the subject of children.
Kat, is there anything else that you've picked up that's a cross-cutting theme that you've seen reflected in other manifestos apart from the SNP's?
I actually, you know what? There's not much else getting through besides the SMP manifesto right now. Likely, I'm in a Labour constituency, and I really don't get much push from Labour. I think maybe they feel a bit safe here in Edinburgh South, where I stay, Southern, I mean. I do think that the Conservatives are very much just pushing the anti-independence theme. But the SNP, what I agree that the SNP's manifesto is the opposite of independence. And I think that's what's necessary to get through to people who are wary or maybe like the SNP because of how they've handled the pandemic in relation to how England has been handled, or the UK government has handled England. And I do think that it probably needs to be pushed a little bit more, that they made a commitment to use the already devolved powers, to not say, hey, we can do this if we get it. These are like real world plans.
Yeah, I think the debate around the recovery is unionist parties are saying it has to be recovery, not independence. Independence supporting parties are saying it's recovery through independence. And I mean, they're never going to agree on that. But there has been agreement about other things. There's been a big emphasis across SNP, Labour and Greens on green issues and on the green recovery. One of the things that slightly worries me about the green recovery, it's often tied into this suggestion that it's about guaranteed jobs. And although guaranteed jobs are great, that often is a disadvantage to women who are possibly not always able to take up paid employment because of caring requirements through childcare or other caring requirements. And actually, universal basic income would be a much better way of spreading that kind of wealth around. But we're not really seeing much discussion about UBI at the moment in this election. Do you think that's something that Scotland should be pushing for, Joyce, as a kind of pilot or an experiment?
Oh, definitely. And I think, I mean, you may be right that it's not, at the top of the agenda for the election, but I think it's remarkable the progress that has been made on the UBI issue in the last few years. Nicola Sturgeon is clearly interested in it, and the current SNP leadership, they're interested in running pilot schemes and all the rest of it. Now, once again, they may be talking a good game and find themselves unable to deliver, but I think there's a huge interest in UBI. Yes, and obviously, if you're looking to a period of very rapid kind of social and economic transition, then a significant UBI is one of the kind of ways that you can sort of oil the wheels, so that, or wind power the wheels, to make sure that transition works and that people are not so fearful of it that they simply resist, and cooperation and sort of creative contribution to it is limited by people's fear of a change that's going to be very negative for them. I mean, I must say, when it comes to the green transition, I like to look at it in the context of Scotland's energy history. I mean, Scotland was a leader even pre-coal in the sort of coal shale sort of technologies that came after water power. We've always had a lot of water power, of course, and then we had this huge sort of heavy industry based on coal, which produced well-paid jobs, albeit very hard and damaging jobs, for generations of men in industrial Scotland, but then went. And then we had the oil revolution, which produced well-paid jobs for some men in some parts of Scotland, and indeed for men from outside Scotland, for a long period in the late 20th century, but now is going. And I think one of the exciting things about sustainable energy is that it's not only the energy that's sustainable. I mean, if we ever succeed in developing a really strong sustainable energy economy, and we've certainly got the potential for that, although we seem to be finding it very difficult on a practical level to kind of get there. But if we ever do that, then the jobs that creates will be forever. Those energies are not going away. So although the installation phase, the massive installation phase of sustainable energy will not go on forever, the sort of maintenance and continuation of the production of that energy will be permanent. It won't be like coal and oil. It won't be a boom that goes away.
Well, maybe it won't be like coal and oil either, that it won't always be about jobs for men, because you were very pointed at pointing that out. And that's always the issue, isn't it, Kat, around jobs that are linked to things like infrastructure, which is the automatic, rather easy suggestion of how we get ourselves out of the downturn that we're in. Let's put money into infrastructure. And that often means road building, bricks and mortar type things, which traditionally employ men and not women. So this is where I'm slightly concerned about the whole push towards the green recovery, that it seems to be not equally distributed between the positive impact it will have on men and women. And as we keep saying, women are the majority of people in the country. So what should the government be doing, Kat, to make sure that women are getting a fair bite or slice of this cake in the future?
Well, one thing I noticed is that there was some money pledged to transitioning from one job to the next. And as you rightly pointed out, a lot of these jobs are held by men currently. So perhaps there need to be some measures put in place to make sure there's, not a simple quota, because that's not going to work, but there needs to be a measure put in place to try and encourage women to enter these job fields. I know that there's a lot of work being done in hydrogen energy development, and I researched my psychology dissertation was on women in STEM and how hard it was to keep women in STEM jobs. That's something that I don't think the government can do, but it's something to keep on our radars. Another thing is that it's been really popular to talk about not starting school until kids are 7. And it really concerns me as someone that's a mother to young children that's been here for this pandemic, is that if my children wouldn't go to school until they're 7, I couldn't afford to do anything or to have a job or anything until then. So there are some measures being put in place to have to fund wraparound care or to have kids in nursery school, not traditional schooling, but in like a nursery program when they're younger, which I think is really, really important because of how the pandemic has hit women in the economy. So I think that the fact that it is, what did you say, weans and windmills at the same time is really, really important. And we cannot separate those two. We have to keep childcare and education and that sort of thing on the radar whenever we're talking about jobs.
Absolutely. And I think that the Greens, who are the people who've suggested that formal schooling waits until 7, which is a very Scandinavian model of education, isn't suggesting that kids are at home until that period, that they would be in a sort of formalised, informal nursery school set up where they are learning, but they're learning through play, they're learning through socialisation, which is terribly important, especially in families which are suffer from extreme poverty, where these opportunities often don't exist. But you're right, there has to be an absolutely comprehensive childcare policy in place, costed, affordable, and with the staff trained to do it. Because at the moment, one of the concerns maybe about the SNP's proposals for wraparound childcare, are there the staff available to put that in place? Obviously, it's a time scale, it'll be over a few years, but we need to see a roadmap on that, I think. And we need to keep reminding politicians across the board, everything you do needs a gender perspective, needs looked at from that point of view. It's not enough now just to have literally jobs for the boys. Douglas Ross has been back in the news because yet again his past has come back to haunt him. He was held to account in the recent leadership debate for comments he'd made about the travelling community dating back to 2017, which he had apologised for, said he shouldn't have said things. He was it related to comments that he made that he thought that local authorities were bending over backwards to help this ethnic minority, and that he really objected particularly to a traveller site being developed in Murray. He said it was too visible. Just when he thought that may have died down, correspondence dating back from 2013 onwards has showed that actually his disgust, there's no other word for it really, of the traveller community is kind of bred in the bone. He tried to have them evicted. He tried to make things so difficult that they would leave and never return. And of course, famously, he said only a few years ago that if he became First Minister, his top priority would be to make stronger enforcement against the Gypsy traveller community. Joyce, the Gypsy traveller community is one of the most persecuted communities across Scotland. These kind of comments really are do not make this man fit to be the leader of any political party, do they? Should he resign?
Well, yes, I think so. I mean, I don't think Douglas Ross represents, even if you are interested in conservatism as a political tradition. I don't think he represents the kind of conservatism that is useful for Scotland. I mean, this kind of petty bigotry against travelling people is. I mean, it exists everywhere, and it's in some parts of Europe, of course, petty bigotry against Roma, who are the kind of descendants, possibly, of travelling people. Um, that reaches really dangerous levels, you know, and to see Douglas Ross attaching himself to that kind of current of thought is just it's really pretty disgusting. I mean, I think particularly in Scotland, where the particular travelling people here are generally speaking not Roma and are not connected to that tradition, they have a very vibrant and wonderful culture, which is really a profound part of history in various areas of Scotland, particularly in the agricultural areas where they used to travel around doing seasonal work. And anyone who knows the wonderful books by Jessie Kesson about her childhood as a child of the traveller community, knows, and the wonderful shows that have been made out of those stories, knows about the tremendous tradition of storytelling and song, and the particular sort of moral customs and attitudes that bound that community together, their attitude to nature, which is of course incredibly topical now because they had a very sort of modest and balanced approach to the way they kind of used the natural resources around them, which our urban civilization could learn a lot from. So this is really a rich part of the whole pattern of Scottish culture. And, you know, Douglas Ross should just sit down with some of these communities and talk to them about their history and about what they want and about the kind of relationships that they want with the more settled community, and not just kind of repeat these really boring, you know, prejudices against a community that ought to be a valued part of our society.
Well, I suspect that society should do that more generally, not just Conservative politicians. But Kat, Joyce has said he doesn't represent the kind of conservatism which is useful for Scotland, but what he absolutely represents and is repeating here is the kind of conservatism, right-wing conservatism of Priti Patel, whose police bill, which will only obviously be impacted in England, has a particular section in it aimed at making most travelling sites illegal, allowing for travellers to be evicted, to be fined, to be imprisoned. Commentators have said it amounted to legislative cleansing, not quite ethnic cleansing, but maybe not far off. So where do you think Douglas Ross is hoping to take this? I mean, it just makes him look like he's a puppy dog, a lapdog of Priti Patel.
Yeah, I've struggled to find anything in which Douglas Ross is a leader. It seems like he takes his walking orders directly from Westminster, whether it's Priti Patel, whether it's Boris Johnson. I mean, does he really have a strategy? I mean, most of the leaflets have Ruth Davidson's picture on it and still promote her above Douglas Ross. So I would say that, you know, for whatever reason, lack of charisma, lack of talent, I don't see Douglas Ross as having an actual ideology. I just think that he's a filler and a placeholder.
Joyce talked about the vibrant community of the travelling people, and what they've actually said, Kat, is that the legislation that they're trying to put in place in England, and it will go through, is going to directly affect that to the point that it could wipe out their lifestyle and their communities. I mean, that's appalling. Why do they think they can get away with this?
I mean, it does seem to be kind of what their whole goal is right now is to, you know, they have this nostalgic vision of what being British or English is supposed to be. And, you know, there's things that people might not want to see. Maybe a lot of times they're trying to drive these people that, you know, when he says these things are too visible. So what do you want these people to not be seen, but yet you don't want to care for them, yet you know, and you want to criminalize their very lives. It's very dangerous. And, you know, I don't think that this like you had said, I don't think this meets the standards of not being considered like a human rights violation on the level that, you know, hopefully, I mean, what can the international community do right now? I'm not sure, but that would be long and drawn out. But I really, I don't have a good answer. I do think that it's really important to stress how they can override Holyrood and try and make this policy for all the UK, and we need to stop that from happening.
I'm not sure that can happen because the police bill is only for England because obviously police in Scotland is devolved. But it's certainly, again, it's another thing that's showing kind of clear blue water between the two countries. I mean, one of the perhaps the most alarming things about Priti Patel's plans, Joyce, is that if they are going to enforce the imprisonment of travelling parents, and what does that happen to the children? It's going to enforce children into care.
Oh, I mean, Priti Patel's proposals are horrendous, and I really, really hope we can resist introducing anything like that in Scotland. It's a clear violation of all sorts of human rights norms. I mean, you've got to remember that travelling people were among, gypsies, as they were described at the time, were among the three groups that were, well, four groups really, that were most victimised in the Holocaust, I mean, it was Jews, socialists, gypsies, and homosexuals were the four out groups. So, any party that campaigns against any of those groups is tapping into the ugliest strand of European history, and the very thing that the people, including very many British people who drew up the European Convention of Human Rights after the Second World War, the very thing that they were trying to prevent is now what so-called conservatives like Priti Patel are introducing. And, it's shameful. It shows a terrible disregard for European history. It also, by the way, shows a terrible disregard for English history, in which travelling people and gypsies have played a huge part. So this is not even about being hostile to newcomers. This community is not a newcomer in England or in Scotland. And so, why? I mean, well, obviously, some Conservative politicians in the present government have gone way beyond the pale into the kind of far-right politics that really wouldn't have been considered acceptable even a decade ago. And they are very, very ugly politicians. And of course, the fact that they are like that is one of the main reasons why support for Scottish independence is generally rising, because with all its weaknesses, the Scottish government is not like that and generally subscribes to all of these international norms and conventions on human rights.
Interesting that you raised that point, that gypsy travellers are not incomers, they're not people from overseas. It's now looking like the English government is turning on part of its own community. I guess that's what right-wing governments do, they other people. And there's always
and
someone
once you
to
start
other.
othering, Maggie, it never stops.
Indeed.
There's never enough others because it's a false agenda in the first place. There's never enough others to kind of soak up all the anger that you've generated. So you have to keep othering different groups.
And maybe that's why the latest poll puts Conservatives 14% ahead. They've doubled their lead over Labour in the last English poll.
There's 101 reasons for that. I think.
Something else for the red wall to get behind. Unfortunately, we seem to spend a lot of time on this programme, or we have in the last few weeks, talking about human rights abuses that Britain are responsible for, all of which continue to erode the UK's international reputation. But it doesn't just stick with domestic politics in terms of impact on people in this country. The Overseas Operation Bill has come back from the House of Lords for a final reading in the House of Commons. This is the bill which, amongst many of its provisions, effectively exempts British soldiers from prosecution for crimes including torture and genocide. It puts in it what's called a presumption against prosecution for that, and historical prosecutions as well. I was looking today, Joyce, to see if I could find any other country in the world that has an exemption against prosecution for war crimes, and I couldn't find any. I wonder if you had any thoughts of who else might be kind of goes down that road.
Well, I think the most notorious kind of refusenik for the International War Crimes Tribunal and all of that is the United States, which has always said that it won't join the International Court on War Crimes, and it won't become part of that kind of international justice system. That it will do its own judging and sentencing when it comes to its serving armed forces. So I suppose that the question that raises is, does anything happen to American service people who infringe various human rights norms within the US justice system? And I'm not an expert on that, but I think this is possibly pretty unique in introducing into our own, or at least the British law. I don't know. Well, that's another question. Would this apply in Scottish law? But certainly introducing into British law the idea that there should be a presumption of innocence against about British armed forces, regardless of what they're accused of. And of course, once again, this is just a kind of sovereigntist. It's like Brexit, and it's like all these other breaches of international law we've been discussing. It's a sovereigntist fantasy that you can create a better world on your own as a single nation without conforming to any international rules or norms, that you're always better at judging it yourself, and that in any case, any jolly decent patriotic chap couldn't possibly be guilty of anything, And I mean, it's absolutely hopeless. It's just no way to deal with the problems of the 21st century. It's immensely heartbreaking to the people who, of a certain generation, actually, the same generation as the Duke of Edinburgh, ironically, who put so much effort into creating those post-war institutions in the hope that they would continue to evolve and strengthen, to then see the UK electing a government which is bent, it seems, on weakening them, insofar as a smallish nation like the UK can weaken them by withdrawing from them and treating them with a fair amount of contempt. So, it's not a type of politics that reflects any kind of understanding of history, is extremely unpleasant. And once again, I just hope there are still sufficient instruments in Scotland to protect us from the worst of this, either by not incorporating it into Scottish law, or by achieving independence and rejoining these sort of international.
Obviously, defence is reserved, and soldiers in Scottish regiments are part of the British Army, and therefore they, I'm assuming, would be covered by this presumption against.
Oh yes, I think for now they would be. Yes.
So I'm not sure.
It's just a question.
Yes, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, it's just a question of whether this presumption of innocence. I mean, were there ever to be an instance where British soldiers, for some reason, ended up in front of a Scottish court? Would that be different? I don't know. I don't.
Yes,
know.
or
But
perhaps
anyway,
whether torture was to happen within the bounds of the country of Scotland. It might be different. Kat, this is effectively putting a whole group of people outside the law. Now, we were talking about the position in the United States. What if the United States don't sign up to international agreements, which means they're not really that they can behave in this kind of way, and we know what's been going on in Guantanamo Bay, but the UK has signed up to these international agreements. Are we now on a collision course with international law over this issue?
I'm not quite sure how that would work. I can say that this was something that I thought I left behind when I emigrated from America, and I'm not looking forward to, and I hope it's not going to happen. If it does, I do hope that international law will, I hope that it will be challenged. But most of these things, it's not like the Treaty of the Union. Most of these things have an out clause because that's what international law requires. But I'm afraid that I don't have expertise in that. And I do want to add that this is something that, even though that, America is not perfect, I'm not going to say that. The kind of exceptionalism that was maybe from a generation or two ago saying, well, we don't need to sign up for that because we'll be okay. We're honest. Trump happened. He pardoned a lot of people who were convicted of war crimes, in the US system, not war crimes, but they were convicted of crimes while they were serving overseas, and he pardoned them. So this is very, very dangerous. And I don't think that, you know, even though we're not like actively right now going to be in the middle of something, like they're giving people license to do very terrible things. And I don't think that it's being highlighted enough.
Well, it's
How
interesting
bad
that
this is.
it's the unelected House of Lords who many of us would like to see be got rid of, who've yet again come back and said, wait a minute, this is not acceptable. So they have returned the bill to the House of Commons with amendments to remove that presumption against prosecution. So that's where the bill sits now. So it will require the House of Commons to overturn what the House of Lords have said. So I don't know how, Kat, you feel about the House of Lords, but do you think it's slightly ironic that this unelected body have once again apparently been seen as the kind of conscience of the UK, making the arguments that really the opposition should be making more strongly, or perhaps even people on the left or centre of the Conservative Party should be making?
Maybe, but I think that maybe that the institution of the British government might want the House of Lords to look good every now and again, because even though we don't want to see it and many of us don't agree with it, this is really good PR for them. So I can't help but think that some of this is by kind of a old agreed upon design that like, well, let's let them be the good guys. You know, I mean, I noticed that happening even when I was in America. You know, for every House of Lords bill that Andrew Lloyd Webber flies in to make himself pay less tax, there's a couple of vetoes that then eventually get overruled. But, you know, the big headlines are, look, the House of Lords are good for something. And let's not forget that Labour does have people in the House of Lords as well.
That's a good point. Okay, coming back to Scotland and something a little bit more positive. In December, we reported on the fact that the BIFAB yards across Scotland, who were seen, if you like, at the forefront of renewable energy production, had to close. They went into liquidation. And this was partly because they were unable to secure a 30 million contract guarantee fund from the Scottish Government, who said that they couldn't provide it because it was in breach of EU state aid laws. And in December, we were still part of the EU, although I understand that state aid law will continue to have an impact in the UK for a couple of years yet. However, the good news is the yards have been bought over by the company who manages Harland Wolff, and there is now a new contract being secured to construct 8 platforms for wind turbines. So we were talking about the green recovery earlier. It could mean up to 290 new jobs in Fife, and it might have a positive impact on the yard in Lewis. So we were talking about just transitions, Joyce. So is this the start of the great promised Scotland being the Saudi Arabia of renewables that has been much shouted from in certain areas?
Well, would that it was, but I think in a way we've kind of missed the boat on the first wave of renewables development. I mean, there are other countries, notably Denmark, similar population to us, far fewer natural resources, but there they are, absolute world leaders in the construction of various kinds of wind farm technology. It's very good news about BIFAB. I really hope that that company can be made to keep going. But, you know, one company with 290 jobs is not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about a whole system, a whole industrial economy, a whole energy economy based on the development of new forms of renewable energy, the resourcing of that development, and on there being, sort of growth paths for companies that are in that area. I mean, I just don't get the sense that there is yet an industrial strategy for Scotland that could really make us anything like world leaders in this field, which is a shame because we definitely have the potential in terms of the amount of energy that's available to be world leaders in this field. And we probably also in our universities and elsewhere have a lot of the expertise and the sort of inventive power. So, it's an area where we're sort of hanging on really to some production capacity by the skin of our teeth, but we really need a kind of systemic approach to growing that and developing it. And I do think this is one of the areas where, even though independence would be desirable, I think there are powers that the Scottish Government has at the moment where that could be done in a more systematic way. And I just wanted to come back, Maggie, to what you were talking about the gender problem with this, because it's something I'm very aware of. And obviously these 290 jobs, I bet, 90% of them will be for men. And it seems to me that we're really looking at a potential crisis for women's employment here as we come into this recovery, because women have taken such a colossal hit during the COVID pandemic. There's surveys that suggest they've been doing up to 70% of the home schooling, that men really haven't been pulling their weight in that respect, that women have been bullied by employers because of their homeschooling commitments, and that a lot of women's position with their employers has been very deeply damaged by the pandemic in ways that will affect their future opportunities and their future earnings. And I think any responsible government at this moment has to have a complete sort of scheme and plan for making sure that women's position in society is not colossally disadvantaged, both by the backwash of the pandemic and by the shape of the transition. Women have to be front and centre. I would say, because we all know this is true, that women can never take their foot off the pedal when it comes to campaigning for equality in society. It is so easy for society just to slip back into that pattern where women are expected to shoulder all the domestic consequences of a crisis and men just carry on as usual. And it's not fair and it's not good enough. But unfortunately, nobody is going to change that without women somehow in their busy lives finding times to organise and fight for it themselves, because nobody else is going to fight for it for us. And that's what history teaches us.
And you're right, in order for that to happen, the whole economic structure has to change, because our economic structure is as it is because of the patriarchy, and unless there's a fundamental root and branch change. So what sorts of things should the Scottish Government now or in the future, whatever government that might be implementing, Kat, to start making this kind of root and branch change in the way that our economy works? There's quite a lot in some of the manifestos about a well-being economy and all of these things, but often just feels like rhetoric. There's not really any teeth behind it. It's not something a lot of people understand. What would you like to see happen to give women in Scotland the feeling that actually they are important and they have a role to play, and more than a role to play, they've a role in leadership?
Well, there are some, with the pandemic, even though women have been hit hard, I know that sometimes the capabilities of the flexibility of working via video conference and things like that have given women some opportunities that they haven't had before. Has it ever equaled out? I don't think so. But I also think that a lot of the jobs, like Joyce had said, are kind of like male-centric jobs. And also, like, when we get into the education system, into higher education, we still have that patriarchal, how many women do you meet that say, well, I'm not good at math because I'm a woman, or I hate math, I'm, as if it's a normal thing. And that's one of the things that I can't stand, because I really do like math. And, I was a flight engineer for 12 years. So I like to push and challenge people when they have those kind of things. Often when you're in those kind of fields, the norm is to be a man, and the norm is to cater to men, and that needs to change. Now, I don't know what kind of a role the government can have in that. I think that it's going to be very much driven by funding, and I think that there needs to be a plan in place to withhold funding if there aren't being the considerations made that would improve the flexibility or improve more women. So not just letting in more women to maybe these programs, but actually making them work for women.
When you were saying that the pandemic had offered women some opportunities, I'm sure that's true, but one of the statistics that really hit me was, and I appreciate that not all nurses are women, but the vast majority of nurses are women. And there have been more nurses have died as a direct result of COVID than the entire First World War That's quite a figure. But sticking for a minute with women's equality, I was amused, I think, to find that the latest push for the race to space is now being couched in terms of women's equality. There has been the Artemis space program under development in the United States for some time. And just this week, it was announced that Elon Musk's company had won the $2.9 billion contract to build the spaceships that will take the next humans to the moon. And they're very excited about this and saying, we will put the first woman on the moon and the first person of colour on the moon, and this will help push the equality of women and people of colour. Now, I'm not anti-science, and I wouldn't want to appear anti-science, especially Kat with you on the programme. And I am aware that space programmes and exploration do have valuable uses back on Earth. I accept that. But the whole thing is being couched in terms of this is good for humanity. So, given that most of the women in the world who demand equality are from the developing world, although not just from there, obviously, how much do you think the thought of putting a woman on the moon, Kat, is going to help them meet their equality targets?
Well, I'm not good at this, like through different national borders and in the international community, but I do know that when there was the space race in America back in the in the 60s, and perhaps it was the same in Russia, having that goal broke down a lot of barriers. There were programs for scholarships, so it was whoever had the best brain. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Hidden Figures, where women kind of were in NASA, and they really broke down a lot of barriers by being smart, and for people just seeing kind of what they had to go through. They couldn't use the toilets in the same building or whatever. So, I mean, is it direct? I would hope that they would have scholarship programs all across the world for that. Is it going to be like that? I have no idea, but I do think it's something that needs attention drawn to it, because as important as it is to see yourself as an astronaut, to see yourself on the moon or whatever, it is really also important to fill these spaces where you develop these technologies, and that's where it will trickle down into different communities, because when you need the best and the brightest, you can find them.
Joyce, 2.9 billion could do a lot for women's equality, couldn't it?
Yes, I mean, there's always this question about space travel. So it's incredibly expensive. It has been very macho, and they're often struggling to prove that it has really brought huge benefits on Earth. But on the other hand, it is the kind of character of our species. If a thing is there, we tend to kind of want to go and explore it. And so I'm actually not as much against this as some people who like to see high levels of social spending. I do like to see high levels of social spending, but I think there is space for kind of exploration and and also for thinking about the people who do that exploration and what they symbolize. So in that sense, I think it's not entirely a bad thing. I mean, one thing I would say has definitely improved for women, Maggie, since I was a wee girl, is the number of really powerful female role models that you can now see in leading political and scientific roles indeed. I mean, they're still a minority, but if you listen to programs like Radio 4's Life Scientific, I mean, the wonderful women who are highlighted on that, who have led lives in science despite all of the assumptions and blocks that they may have encountered, and are now in leadership positions. There are far more female political leaders than there used to be. Scotland has a female political leader. So I think young women are seeing that they can do these things in a much more concrete sense than they would have when I was young, and I think that just has to be a good thing. But as Kat was saying, it has to be fleshed out in scholarships, in programs for getting women into science subjects, in programs for getting women into politics, and above all in the support that means that the domestic responsibilities that women have traditionally taken are more fairly shared out in society. community and within the family.
The programme is called Artemis, after the Greek goddess of the moon, and there is a very nice graphic, which is sort of stylised picture of the goddess. And the people behind Artemis have said that they believe all women can see themselves in this abstract image. And it's maybe time we pointed out that the image really looks like a kind of white European woman, and actually most women in the world aren't white and European, so probably not. Anyway, watch this space. The final frontier for women's equality? I don't think so. Obviously, as I said, they were also including people of colour. Actually, the reality for people of colour in the United States at the moment is you're more likely to be shot than go to the moon. You're more likely to be in prison than be in college. And yet again this week we have seen another mass shooting in Indianapolis, where I think 4 people from the Sikh community were killed, and there are a large number of Sikh people who work in that facility. Now, I don't think the person who did the shooting, who also turned the gun on himself, I don't think the motive has been understood, but it may well have been racially motivated. Kat, this must, as an American, make you feel very, very sad to see your country constantly in the news about these kinds of things.
It is. Indianapolis is not far from where I grew up, and actually the town I grew up in is Oak Creek, Wisconsin, where they had a mass shooting at a Sikh temple some years ago. So, like maybe a decade ago. That one, the shooter had mistaken the Sikh temple as a Muslim place, and it was a hate crime against Muslims. So, whether or not that's the motivation, there was just a mass shooting where a bunch of Asian women were, and we moved here, before he started school. So it still trickles. I mean, it's such an impactful thing that I can't imagine, like the burden that is on parents, the burden that is on these children. There was a 7th grader that was shot and killed this last week. And I don't know. I kind of throw my hands up because I don't have any answers to it. I know they're talking about training and whatever, but there's really not enough training fast enough to change this. I just, yeah, there needs to be some change, and I'm a bit beside myself with the continuation of this violence.
Joyce, before we came on air, you were talking about a meme that you've seen doing the rounds on social media about all the things that Black people need to avoid doing if they don't want to be shot. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I don't know who originated it, but it was, yeah, it was just a list of, it's like written in the person of a Black mother in the United States who's about to go out with one of her children to go to dance class or something, and she's listing with the names of the victims in a little bracket beside each item on the list, all the things that she must be careful not to try to do, not visit the local convenience store, not stop for a pizza, not stop for any fast food, not drive away quickly from a traffic light, not, all of the things that the police have said were the reason that they stopped Black people who they then shot dead. And it is absolutely terrifying. And I've heard previously, particularly Black men, but also Black women, talking about the ways in which they have to be careful, even if they are very high status people, even if they have a badge saying that they're a professor at the local university or whatever, they still constantly have to be aware of not provoking any behaviour that might cause the police, not performing any behaviour that might cause the police to shoot them. And that is an outrage. And I mean, the numbers in America are sky high. We're talking about 1,000, people dying at the hands of the police every year, where in Britain, typically 5 people would die in police custody a year. It's 5 too many, but, it's just on a completely different scale. And obviously there's some kind of culture going on in a lot of US police forces that just makes them unable to cope properly with policing the kind of communities that they're in. And I mean, the woman who conducted the shooting in which a young man was killed, woman police officer, said that she had intended to taser him and shot him by mistake. And yet she was a trainer. She was a firearms trainer. You know, she was one of the people responsible for training people how to use their guns and their tasers. And so you just begin to think that there are levels of panic going on within the police force, which are just in themselves a colossal problem. It's like police people are so afraid of violence coming towards them from the black community that they can't think straight. I mean, that's how a lot of these incidents look to me. And I mean, I don't know what the solution to that is, but maybe if you identify that as the problem, then you can begin to get somewhere. There's a wonderful show by the New York artist Dale Orlander Smith, who is a solo show in which she simply went to Ferguson, Missouri, and talked to a lot of people in that community around the death of the young man who was shot dead there in around, I think it was 2013, and there were massive riots. It was one of the earliest sort of big Black Lives Matter uprisings. And that is a wonderful show which really tries to penetrate into the thinking of all sorts of people, you know, veteran civil rights campaigners, young black boys, racist policemen, out and out white supremacists, all of them are there. And she plays every single one of them as a black woman in New York.
I saw that at the Traverse at the Edinburgh Festival. Would that be right?
It's called, I think it's called Until the Flood or Before the Flood.
Yeah, I saw that at the Traverse a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago at the Edinburgh Festival. An extraordinarily powerful piece. And I think
it's that kind of detailed work into the human reasons behind this level of fear and anxiety that has to be done to get to the bottom of it. But my goodness, it's a long and difficult job. And all I can say is that at least the United States has a presidency which might at least be trying to promote some of that kind of healing work rather than one that's actively exacerbating the problem.
Well, Biden has certainly is on the record of saying that one of the things he really wants to tackle is gun crime in the United States. But it isn't just gun crime in the hands of civilians. It clearly has to be the use of guns in the hands of the police. Raising that issue of that play brings us nicely to the last story I wanted to look at, and that is in fact the Edinburgh Festival. So the Edinburgh Festival have announced, as we reported this week, that they will return this year in a limited programme, mostly music, very little drama, in outdoor venues, tents, in shorter productions. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that the Scottish climate is particularly useful for outdoor events, but it's good to see. Joyce, obviously, with your role as a theatre critic, you must be pleased about this, but I'm wondering, have you heard if there are any plans about the Edinburgh Fringe? How that's returning? They've been a bit quiet about it, sort of teasing messages on their website. I just wondered briefly if you knew what they were planning, if anything.
Well, you see, there's two words in there that don't really compute, Maggie, and that's plan and fringe. When it comes to the Edinburgh Fringe, the big venues can try to make plans. They can consider what they would have been doing in normal circumstances and see if they can adapt that to pandemic circumstances. So you're talking about, you know, the Pleasance, the Gilded Balloon, Assembly, Underbelly, these, and of course Summerhall, which is now one of the most important venues. You know, they can think in that way as sort of mini programmed festivals. But the thing about the Fringe is that it kind of depends on the sort of voluntary enthusiasm of, you know, thousands upon thousands of performers who just want to come here and give their work a bit of a punt in front of this huge international audience which used to gather in Edinburgh every August, and every single predisposing condition for that is completely disrupted by the pandemic. And I think we just have to be realistic that although some big venues may be able to do something in the way of outdoor work, particularly the ones which have a year-round presence in Edinburgh, like the Traverse and Summerhall may be able to organise something. Summerhall has some outdoor spaces. The Traverse has a lot of potential for distance performances and all of that. But I think for the for the kind of whole of the Fringe, you know, the kind of entirety of it, to come back in anything like the form that we used to know is quite a tall order under anything like pandemic conditions. And it may be years or it may be never that we see the Fringe come back in this sort of huge size. I mean, a really astronomical size, which people who have never really tried to get to grips with it can barely understand that it had achieved by 2019. The official festivals and the bigger official arts venues are a different matter. They've been supported to survive the strongly supported to survive the pandemic, and they should be able to come back. And I'm delighted to see the Edinburgh Festival beginning to do that in the kind of outdoor spaces, which, although they may be a bit chilly, Maggie, at least look as if they're going to be protected from the rain, which will be lovely.
Which is more than you can say about the tattoo, and people go and sit in the rain and watch the tattoos. So,
They
fine.
will,
Kat,
very happily.
it has to be. I mean, one of the real disappointments in terms of the pandemic is the way that the arts community have really not been supported. I accept that venues, big venues, have been given grants, but what's really upset me is that individuals, both people who work on stage and behind the scenes, individual theatre makers really haven't had the kind of support. And I'm really worried that we're going to see not just a reduced Fringe, which I don't think would necessarily be a bad thing, but this is going to have a massive impact on the arts and culture sector generally. Are you concerned about that, or do you think they'll bounce back? Kat.
So one thing that I was just talking about this with Graham Campbell, who has ties to both Glasgow and Edinburgh, and is, you know, has a very vested interest in the arts. He was saying that as the Fringe comes back, we really have an opportunity, as the Fringe comes back incrementally, perhaps, we have an opportunity to perhaps try to get more local artists and maybe a percentage more of local workers and local artists that are able to participate, because as needed as it is to have all these acts come and descend on Scotland and on Edinburgh for this, it's exciting. And I mean, I love the Fringe. I miss it so much. It would be really great to have more artists from around Scotland have the opportunity to come and give us a show. I would really like to see that as we build back. One of my real good friends and neighbors is a comedian, and I know how difficult, like, you know, it went from, well, this is an okay break, to, oh my gosh, what are we going to do, to thank goodness I got a little bit of a grant money, to now, like, we don't know when this is going to ever be a thing again. So, I mean, I miss the live comedy. I really do. So, I mean, I think that Scotland has a really good culture of supporting the arts. It could always be better, but I'm just, the pressure needs to stay on, and I'm just glad that we have the Fringe, and I don't want to lose that.
One of the things, Joyce, that strikes me about the Fringe is that it has effectively become dominated by comedy over the years. It gets the best slots, the evening slots are given over to comedy, not theatre. And I guess if you're a comedian sitting at home in the pandemic, there's nothing to stop you developing material and ideas for a show. So it might be quite easy for you to come back up to the Fringe and do something. But if you're a theatre maker, if you're involved in drama, and especially in Scotland where the theatres haven't been open at all, that's going to be really, really hard. So what worries me is that we're going to see the impact of theatre, the theatre part of the Fringe, reduce even more. And that's got to be something that would be a tragedy, surely.
Well, I'm going to say don't panic in large friendly letters, because although it is often said, particularly by the great sage of the Edinburgh Festival, Richard DeMarco, that it's all been taken over by comedy, actually the proportion of theatre to comedy in the Fringe has not varied much over the last generation. But as you say, Maggie, it's the comedy gets the high profile slots. And of course, there are a lot of people in London who don't know that there's anything else in the Fringe except comedy. But in fact, there is a huge amount of theatre usually. I think you're right that the theatre the theatre has been particularly hard hit by this pandemic. It's possibly been even harder hit than things like orchestral music, which have been pretty well devastated, in the sense that theatre is so much a collaborative art form. You simply can't do it without getting into a room together. And all that theatre companies have been able to do really during the pandemic has been to kind of re-advertise their previous work, produce little extracts from their previous work, or in the very rare cases where they've been allowed into theatres to work together, and there's been a little in England and in Scotland, they've been able to create new work, but in very strange circumstances, with all the cast distanced from each other, and of course no audience, or generally speaking, or a very small audience in the auditorium. So it's been really devastating for the spirit of theatre. I mean, you know how important pantomime is to Scottish theatre. And I was just laughing last, well, I mean, you have to laugh or you would cry, with Julie Ellen of the MacRobert Arts Centre at Stirling last Christmas, about the fact that if you were trying to devise something that would pass on COVID infection, you could not do better than a pantomime performance in a packed theatre. You know, everybody's shouting, the cast are all crowded onto this big cast, crowded onto the stage, singing their heads off, audience crowded into the seats, singing their heads off, shouting and yelling behind you, all the rest of it. It is absolutely the thing that has been rendered most impossible by the COVID epidemic. And, you know, I think theatre will recover, because that thing that theatre does for people is so essential, and such a brilliant way of celebrating the way that we live together and tackle problems together and dream together and laugh together. Of course that will come back, but my goodness, it's been hard. And as I say, it's been less hard for the big organisations, which have been supported, and to give them their due, have done what the Scottish Government asked them to do in trying to employ as many freelancers as possible with the money that they've had. You know, freelancers do make most of the theatre that we see. They just do it through the vehicle of the big companies, and they have really been trying to do that during the pandemic, employ as many freelancers as possible. But my goodness, it has been hard for people who have not fallen within that sort of fortunate group who have managed to get employment somewhere. And it's been particularly hard on those who have not qualified for the self-employed income support scheme, because their work is partly PAYE and partly self-employed, and that has been terribly hard for them.
And that has, a lot of people have fallen into that hole. But on that positive note about how important theatre is for us as humanity, and certainly I will not consider the pandemic over and things back to normal till I can get my bum on a seat in a theatre. That's the marker for me. You can keep your nightclubs, you can keep your pubs, just get me into a theatre, please, and all will be well. Thank you both very much for joining me today. That's been a wide-ranging discussion. I hope people at home have enjoyed it. It just leaves me to remind you that, as ever, it takes money to make these programmes, to keep Broadcasting Scotland going. So please go on to the website, www.broadcastingscotland.scot/register, and donate. Help us keep going. Help us keep going right the way through the election, and help us keep going until and if we get an independence referendum and beyond. We've lots of exciting ideas and plans in the coming months, and you can help. Again, thank you to my guests. Everyone, have a lovely Sunday afternoon. I know it's raining, but get out there and meet the 5 other people that you're allowed to. Good afternoon.
Not raining in Edinburgh. Thank you.